It's a great pleasure to be here. It really is. Yesterday was outstanding in terms of the breadth and the depth of the research that's being done here. And I'm only too aware, as somebody outside of Australia, the influence that Australia is having on this particular research area. So I thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to... I'm not quite sure how you will feel about this, but I want to maybe just raise some questions about some of the things that we are taking as givens. And I've also probably taken the risk of embedding 2 little videos in this, which if they don't work, my apologies. And I've got to master. I come from Edinburgh. This is our skyline. It's the university kind of screen, not mine, right? So it's to encourage you to come visit. Okay, so what I want to talk about is to try and understand the scale of the problem. When I started to prepare my slides, I inevitably started to talk about the problem is getting bigger, the kind of more serious in terms of the range of things that it's impacting on in relation to child safety, and here are the numbers to account for it. And then I stopped and I thought, well, how do we make sense of some of these numbers? So I'm going to look at that. So forgive me if I kind of rattle on about that. I need to make reference to the legislative frameworks. We've all had our eye on Australia since you suddenly announced that you're actually banning access for young people under the age of 16. And I think everybody stood up and took notice, especially at the speed that this has happened, right? And that's triggered a response in the UK as well, which is interesting. And I talk a little bit about that. And then I want to look at responding to the problem. And Australia has been the heart of situational crime prevention. Most of the papers that are coming out come from here and have done historically as well. So I'm going to borrow a little bit from that, and I want to look at some examples. And then I want to move on to crime opportunity theory, and I'm not talking in any great detail about any theoretical models, because you've had that over the course of today, and yesterday, and you probably will today. But I want us to start then to think about affordances. Because when we talk about the environment in relation to these crimes, I think this is an interesting one. We do talk about the technological environment in which they take place, but we don't consider in many ways both the opportunities that technology offers for us, but also the ways that it might be misused. And I'm going to look at that in some specific instances. So I'm going to start off by talking about the scale of the problem. And in response to some very serious sexual crimes that took place in the US, there was an inquiry launched. And as part of the inquiry, they commissioned a series of rapid evidence reviews. And there was one that was done by Armstrong, I think back in 2018, which I thought was interesting because it forced us to think about how we actually think about the evidence in relation to online child sexual abuse. And so when I again started, the starting point, I was going to talk about some of the numbers in relation to CSAM distribution. But if you think about it in this larger scale, right, so we've got victim prevalence data, and you've got some recent survey data out that I'm going to just make reference to. We've got offender prevalence data, which is a bit more difficult, and we have CSAM numbers. And if we look at these in turn, okay, when we talk about online child sexual abuse, or technology-mediated sexual abuse, or technology-facilitated sexual abuse, or many of the other terms that we have created to talk about this population, we're not talking about a single crime. We're talking about a collection of crimes. And I think this is really important when we think about situational crime prevention, because there isn't such a thing as, well, there is such a thing that refers to many things when we talk about online child sexual abuse. And I took this, well, it didn't look like that when I took it, right? It's in text. But I took this from the recent prevalence surveys that have been done in the US by David Finkelhor and his group of researchers. And I'm sure everybody knows David Finkelhor's work. He's been a significant figure in this area for very many years. And they started out in their most recent prevalence survey of looking at, well, using the literature, how can we categorize what these crimes are? That's the shortened version, so they ended up with 9. They started out with 18. And these are not discrete. So we've got online solicitation, we've got online child sexual abuse. These are the numbers underneath here that relate to this, which an online child sexual abuse was all of their screening questions. So they are overlapping, they're not discrete. But what you can see across all of these, and most of them are going to be familiar to you, is that prevalence rates vary across these crimes. So depending on what it is that you're looking at, the numbers look different. And I think that is really important because we tend to cluster all of this, and there is a good reason why we would do that. So if you look at that figure there for online child sexual abuse, which was all of their screening questions put together, you can see that the numbers are high. Okay, and if we go on and we look at, because I was so aware that I was going to talk too long, right? I've kind of pushed things in here, but if we look at your most recent study by Walsh et al. In 2025, we've got about 21.3% of Australian children experienced either one or both non-consensual sharing of sexual images of children and requests by adults for children to talk about sex or send sexual images. That's very high. And we've got over 80% of non-consensual sharing of sexual images of children were perpetrated by adults. Now, this is going to be a kind of a recurrent theme, and the question that was just asked right at the very end of the first presentation about the criminalization of children in relation to some of the terrorist-related crimes, I think is a salient one for this as well. And I'm not the only person who would feel some discomfort in thinking about minors in relation to these sexual crimes, many of which are image-related crimes. And I think this is something maybe that we have to think a little bit more about in terms of both our response and how we make sense of that activity. And then underneath, I've just put a meta-analysis, right? So we've got 123 studies. Recent publication by Fry and et al., right? From 2010 to 23. So we've got some earlier studies here. So 123 studies, and the mean prevalence rate for past year recall of online child sexual abuse. Again, we've got differences between the categories. So online sexual solicitation, 12.5%, non-consensual taking, sharing, and exposure to sexual images and videos, 12.6%. Mean prevalence rate was 8.1%, and that's much lower than the two most recent studies in the US and in Australia. But it's really quite hard if you look across studies, and the meta-analysis would also kind of point to this as well, is that there's a lack of consensus about definitions. What is it that we're talking about here? We use different definitions of OCSA and its components. There's overlapping categories of OCSA. So if you look again at Finkelhor's study, you will see that some of the discrete categories then are brought together in a single group. There are inconsistencies in measurement. So we are measuring different things. We're using different measurement tools. And we have a lot of data. So particularly, and I'm just, correct me if I am wrong, right? So maybe I've misread some things, and I'm quite prepared to say I'm sorry. But if we look at the data, the most recent data from Australia and the US, we've got an awful lot of offender-related data, so who was the offence committed by, which is largely unknown. And how we interpret the unknown, I think, is quite interesting. The study in Australia specifically was talking about, in terms of online solicitation, was talking about adults. The data from the US is slightly more difficult to disentangle in relation to that. But unknown, does the unknown mean that this was stranger, or does unknown mean that this was somebody close within my family network? And the work that's come from the US and elsewhere is pushing very strongly to say that the bulk of these sexual crimes against young people actually involve somebody who they know. And I think that probably is certainly the case for a lot of the crimes where they are peer-related. When they've taken place in a relationship that's gone wrong, or maybe they're motivated by some other non-sexual reasons as well. So we've got lots of data where we're not quite sure what it's telling us, and we also have a changing technology landscape. So Finkelhor had 18 categories, and I can almost guarantee that by next year we've added maybe another 1 or 2, simply because this rapid change of technology offers different opportunities to do different types of sexual crimes. And then we've got offender samples, and I've really just kind of reduced this down to one slide. So we've got the data, again, recent data from Sullivan et al., 2025, reported handling of unlawful sexual material. That was CSAM and IBSA offences, 24% of all sexual offences, enabling unlawful sexual conduct, including grooming of children for a sexual offence and using a carriage service to procure a child for sexual activity was 7%. And then we have Canadian data, which is really quite difficult to actually get your head around, where we've got overall rate of police-reported OCSE incidents, that was online sexual offences against children and online pornography, so we've got quite a lot sitting in that, was 160 incidents per 1,000 children in 2022, so that they could demonstrate that there had been an increase in crime since 2014. So we have a perception that these crimes are rising, they're increasing. But if you look across samples, it really is quite hard to make comparisons between countries. There's difference in legislation. There's difference in reporting across countries. It reflects only people within the criminal justice system. And as we know, as reference already been made to the dark web, that we've got an awful lot of people who are not in the criminal justice system who are committing these crimes. In many countries, if you actually look at the data, they don't disaggregate online crimes from other sexual crimes. They tend to get all lumped in together, so it's quite hard to make any sense of that. And we also know that multiple factors are going to influence prevalence data. So we've got police resources, kind of an obvious one. Changing legislation. If we don't have legislation, then we're not going to have arrests. And changing crime opportunities. Okay, so this all sounds very negative. I don't mean it to be negative. We've also got CSAM-related data. And for me, I think this would have been my starting point. NICMEC, in their 2023 report, they've yet, I don't think, to bring out their 2024 report yet. So our service providers submitted 54.8 million images to the cyber tip line. So as we know, NICMEC, National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, is the US mandated organization, that will not only assess, and they generate a database of material, but they will refer on packages on to other countries. That looks like an enormous number, and it is an enormous number, but we know that some of those would have been AI detected, probably do not meet the criteria that NCMEC would use in terms of whether they're meeting the criteria for illegality. And the reality is that of the 54.8 million images, 41% were novel, which means that the largest number of images had already been seen. These were not new. And the same with videos. We've got 23% were new to NCMEC. They had nothing to match them with in terms of their data archive. The data from InHope, which is a collection of hotlines asking the public to report if they come across content that they think is illegal, was much higher. I really don't know why that is. That may be something to do with differences in legislation. That may be something to do with reporting mechanisms. I don't know. And then we've got from the UK, the Internet Watch Foundation. So their report in 2023, 26% of the content was unique out of all the content that was identified. Their identification comes from reports, not from industry, but reports from the public, but also through their own web crawlers, which they use in relation to spaces where they know that offenders are likely to be and images are likely to be. So we've got huge challenges in making sense of this data. We've got different data sources, public reports versus a web crawler. We've got different categorization systems. If you look across how we categorize the data in the US to, I've taken across Europe, and then by the Internet Watch Foundation in the UK, we use a different system of categorizing what these images actually are and where they fit. And I think all it leaves us to say is that the volume of content remains still largely unknown. We do not know what it is that we are dealing with. I also think, and I feel as though I may be raising hairs here, that we have some quite considerable challenges. We know that if we look at public reports, for example, in the main, what the public reports are going to be of children who are clearly able to be identified as children. Once we reach puberty, it becomes much more difficult to actually know whether this is a minor or somebody over the age of 18. So there are challenges with this. What we also have challenges with is that I don't know of, and please, I would love to hear from you if you do, how we make some sense of these self-produced. The terminology is awful. We've gone down roads in the UK of talking about first-person produced images, but I don't think that's going to actually be adopted anywhere else, and it's not being widely used. So let's talk about self-produced content by adolescents. This is not about blaming adolescents, but it's the fact that they produce the content. Much of the content would be produced in solicitation, and solicitation can range from persistent acts of asking, do send me, do send me, do send me, things that we do in everyday life, right the way to threats to share former content or whatever. Do we have a good way of categorizing these images? I've never seen them. So while I know what the images look like, and I know about the variety of content, some of which represent quite serious sexual acts, from somebody being asked to send photos of being penetrated by an object, all the way through to pictures of kind of somebody's breasts or somebody's genitalia, their legs spread open. So there's a whole range, but has anybody actually categorized those, made sense of those? No. In terms of this data, the report data, how they would know whether or not the images are self-produced or not self-produced, again, is something of a mystery, not a complete mystery, and there are good reasons to be able to say that there is corroborative information that would tell us that this is being produced by a young person themselves. And we've also now got thrown into the kind of the mixture AI-generated images. And outside of images where there are obvious anomalies, we still find it very difficult to actually differentiate some of the images that are being produced by AI from actual images of children. Places an increased burden on investigators, amongst other things as well. So, what are the implications of this? I've started, you know, I do need to be mindful of time. I started with kind of, whoa, right? Well, it's interesting because we all hope that things like crime rates will come down, the number of images being kind of identified will come down, that the level of victimization will come down. But I would think that in at least the short term, as we become more effective in identifying offenders, right? Reporting, locating CSAM, which is now largely automatic, and encouraging more disclosures or greater discovery of young people who are victimized, then the numbers are going to go up. They're not going to come down, they'll go up. So when we start to think about some of the things that we use to measure crime reduction, paradoxically, the better we are at our jobs at the minute, if so, the numbers will actually rise. So how do we know that we are getting on top of these problems? Now, I want to make a shift here because I want to talk about this notion of a person's situation, so a contextual approach and public health models. So rather than responding to crimes once they've actually happened, a person's situation approach and public health models would argue for proactive initiatives, shaping the environment in such a way as to reduce the likelihood of offending or reoffending. And we've got some really good examples, some of which have come from Australia in relation to this. And what I'm going to try and do is to think about some of the initiatives that we've seen across primary pre-event, secondary event, and tertiary post-event. The categorizations are, I think, often disputed, but anyway. And I think what we know is that when we start to look at prevention, situational prevention of online abuse and exploitation, it requires strategies that reduce, for example, opportunities to access children, as well as illegal images, by making the activity less rewarding, more difficult, and riskier. So I'm going to look at these few briefly. So in legislation, pre-event, event, and post-event. And this was where you'll see if I've got this wrong with my videos, they won't work. Right, so there's a growing argument for legislation, not just in Australia, although everybody has their eye on you. We've got this in the EU. EU moves slowly. It doesn't move like Australia. It represents, 26 plus countries. So it's a slow process. But in fact, it's attempting to do much of what Australia has already done and what has started to happen in the UK. So detect and report content, reduce the risk of misuse, and have transparency in terms of how people know that you're doing that. And there's also, which I think is a little bit more exciting, the proposal to have an independent EU centre on child sexual abuse, which will support providers, provide expertise to a larger group of both providers as well as researchers and as well as people who work in this space. And I think that's a good thing if it ever happens. We clearly have our UK Online Safety Act, which came into the end of 2023, came into moved into a legal provision. Again, removing illegal content quickly, preventing children from accessing harmful and age-inappropriate content, age checking, so age verification, strong age verification has become a mission there. Ensure risks and dangers posed to children are more transparent. This is not just in relation, clearly, to child sexual abuse. And provide parents and children with clear and accessible ways to report problems online when they do arise. And then we've got the amendment to your Act, which is the one that everybody is looking at. Service providers to introduce systems and processes that ensure that people under the minimum age cannot create or keep a social media account. And what is really interesting here is that the onus is on the tech industry themselves rather than on either the parents or the young people. And I think this is going to come into place by end of this year. And it will be really interesting to see, because people will be watching what difference this makes, introducing this both across a range of adolescent well-being measures, I'm sure, looking about whether it changes, for example, classroom behavior, and whether it reduces the experiences of children in terms of sexual violence. It will be interesting to see how you tackle the evidence for that. And again, that's something I think that is worth for us watching this space. And I'm going to come into some pre-event examples. I'm going to look a little bit about kind of self-help reporting and media campaigns. And I'm going to point to media campaigns. I don't know whether you've had very many media campaigns. Yes? Okay. Well, I'm going to talk about just one that is just happened in Scotland, because I've just got some data that's not been shared as yet. So media campaigns look interesting. They provide opportunity to reach very large audiences at a relatively small cost. It promotes, hopefully, a voluntary change in people's behavior. It focuses on changing public attitudes, knowledge, social norms. The hope is that this will lead to behavior change. It targets motivated to change behavior when the actual perceived threat is high, and we see that particularly in relation to online child sexual abuse, and where there is an alternative response available. And so it's easy to implement, and it's low cost. And we know that fear messages are effective if accompanied by a high efficacy message. So where you have a fear message, but this is some way where you may get help. You may address the problems that you have. And you'll avoid negative consequences if you get help now. And we know that there is also bystander effects from this. So when we have a public health campaign, and we have a campaign that relates to, for example, online child sexual abuse or accessing images, we know that that goes out to a large group, even if we have targeted audiences. So in the UK, we've often used very targeted audiences, kind of partnering with people like Lads Bible, whose demographic of users is a kind of much younger group. It will still get to bystanders, and bystanders might be somebody within the home or somebody who works with you, whatever. So you may have a bystander effect. So you're changing not only your target audience, but you're changing kind of maybe the possibility of other people's behavior that may additionally help, in some ways, may help the likelihood that somebody will seek help. So it's an indirect effect. And media campaigns involving large populations are expected to cost an awful lot less than clinical interventions. And so there's a good reason why we invest in these. So this is the most recent one that was done by Police Scotland. We've had UK-wide ones, but this one is one that's been just targeting in Scotland itself. And it's really focusing on, have you been looking at sexual images in children? Now, the hope is that you're getting people at a very early stage in their criminal career, and you will disrupt this offending. And as you can see, we've got get more help before lives are ruined. And this is the campaign video.
All right, see you later.
You might just be having a peek. A little look. A wee glance. But that's how it starts. Viewing sexual images of children under 18 is illegal. Just like sexual conversations with children are illegal. You can't hide. You will get caught, and everyone will find out. Stop it now and get help before more lives are ruined.
Right. I think it's an interesting message. I think the "you will get caught" is a strong message, although I think we all know that very many people will not be detected. But it's meant to deter the criminal acts that are taking place, and it's meant to offer some hope of kind of changing. And what evidence do we have? So from this particular campaign, and don't forget, we're talking about a small population here, right? We had 165,000 website visits from users in Scotland, which was, I think this is an interesting one, which was 1,670% increase compared to 6 weeks before, right? We've got 78,000 unique visits to the actual materials that were packaged around this. And we've got a considerable increase from our previous campaign, which was in 2023. So we've got, again, a 3,924% increase, showing an unprecedented leap in engagement. So this is people actually following through on material that was placed across a whole range of social media platforms. How many people actually, out of this very large number, sought help? Well, 847 people actively engaged with specialist resources for those worried about their behaviour in the 6 weeks where the measurements were taking place. There were 31% increase in the helpline calls and 25% increase in online chat users. Are they large numbers? They are significant numbers, not statistically significant numbers. They're statistically different than the kind of the previous numbers that we're going through. But is this a large number? Well, if you think about this from a public health campaign, it also attracted a lot of social, rather kind of mainstream media attention. There was BBC News, BBC Good Morning Scotland, all picked up on this, all kind of showed the video, all gave kind of information about where you can go for help. It was in all the national newspapers and kind of UK newspapers as well. So, Police Scotland feel that this is really a very good response. How will we know in the long term what difference that makes? And that's a much more difficult question to answer. We took all of the previous campaigns that have been done by Stop It Now, and we analysed the data across the campaigns. And what we can see was that during active campaigning periods, there was an increase in people calling the helpline and visiting the website, the Stop Now website. And they were more likely to seek help after viewing campaign materials during the active periods than the non-active periods. So we can show that there is a relationship there. And the help seekers were predominantly, but not exclusively, there was a bystander effect, men concerned about their own behaviour. So we know that public health campaigns may be effective in terms of promoting help seeking, which we assume is going to lead to the prevention of some of this abusive behaviour. So we have some data there that is encouraging. And then, and I know that I'm not going to talk about this in any great detail, but I think this has been a really interesting campaign. So we've got the Think Before You Share campaign for young people. Is there any evidence that relates to this? I'm not quite sure, and I'm not sure what the evidence will be. It's recently launched. So this is targeting young people as actors, and it's asking them to think about what they're doing before they share sexual images. And if you think about the number of sexual images that make up our kind of total number of images reported to our helplines, and are also engaging kind of law enforcement, I think it's a laudable thing to do. It's encouraging parents. There's a whole kind of package of material for parents to have timely conversations. I think that's a good one, timely conversations. Educators with children and young people. And we heard something about this yesterday if you were in some of the sessions that I was in. So the goals are raising awareness about risks of sharing nude images, encouraging thoughtful decision-making before sharing personal content online. I think this is an interesting one for all of us, because thoughtful decision-making when sexually aroused, I think is compromised for all of us. If I was kind of 17, 16, 15, I'm not quite sure that I would be thoughtfully thinking before I shared my image, but never mind. Facilitating open and judgment-free conversations between young people and trusted adults. So not blaming. So trying to have conversations that are supportive. And here is one. It's very... To the age of boys. Okay, I have not seen anything that talks to evaluation here. So I'm sure they're going to be looking at how many people actually used the materials, how many people viewed the videos, how many people actually went on to look for their support materials. I'm sure they will look at all of those. So I think it's an interesting, and I think it's worthwhile to do. It's quite hard to evaluate what difference it might make. So we're back to the, okay, this is really good, gets people talking. Anything that encourages to talk with our children about this topic, I think, is to be lauded. But if you look at prevention campaigns, and I know that there is going to be a kind of another workshop on this, so I'll tread carefully here. The data that we have on education as prevention seems to indicate that we are quite good at improving knowledge of risky behaviours and improving retainment of that information, but we're not that good at actually affecting changes in online risky behaviour. So I've just put up a systematic review there. That should have been systematic review, not systematic of prevention, so I'm sorry about that. So again, we're in the same, okay, what are we expecting of this, and how maybe do we start to affect behavioural change? I know of now, I think, 1 or 2 studies that have focused specifically on online sexual harm, one of them which has come from Spain, which was able to show that in the short term there was fewer, it was very target specific, so it was children who'd been involved in online solicitation, online grooming activities, and they could show that there was a reduction in engagement with. So people pulled out of relationships rather than engaged when they were approached. So you've got some maybe emerging evidence there, and this was a very short intervention. Okay, so think about kind of hardening access through, right. Now I've got, I think the author of this is somewhere very close. Can't see his face now, at least one of them. Right, the Rethink chatbot. I'm not going to talk a lot about this because this isn't my work. I was involved in a peripheral way with this. Warning messages for offenders or those at risk of offending. So we've got Rethink. It was an engagement, which was a real coup. It was an engagement with ILO, who are Pornhub, right? In the UK, so you've got one of the biggest providers here of sexual materials, sexual materials. And I think what is interesting is that if you look at some of the kind of the other research on ways into offending for many online, certainly CSAM offenders, we can't say that looking at pornography, oh, there you are, looking at pornography causes somebody to acquire sexual images of children. There is not a kind of causal relationship there. But it does seem to play a part for some men, at least, in terms of a pathway into seeking out sexual material involving children. So this was, I think, a really big coup that we've got a big industry partner involvement in it. So it's providing warning information if people start using a particular set of search terms that Pornhub knew were associated with people looking for child abuse material. So you'd get a warning message and the opportunity to engage with a chatbot. I think I would be right in saying that the chatbot was a bit clunky in its earlier iterations. And in fact, I think it got more abuse than it did actual kind of interaction, right? And a possibility, so they're reminded about the illegality of CSAM and referred to, again, Lucy Faithful Foundation's free, anonymous support and advice services, which is similar to what we were talking about before in the campaign data for people who are concerned about their attraction to CSAM. So the research questions were, is Rethink reducing CSAM-related searches on Pornhub? Is Rethink increasing referrals to Lucy Faithful Foundation, which was an anonymized service because you're calling a helpline? To what extent is Rethink chatbot contributing to that aim? And I don't think I know too much about the last one, so I'm not going to talk about that. Well, I suppose the good news is that the majority of people, so 99% of sessions didn't contain a search that triggered the warning. Right? Except, just think about the volume of traffic to Pornhub, which is absolutely enormous. So the chatbot was displayed 2.8 million times between March 22 and August 23, resulting in 1,656 requests for more information and Stop It Now services, 490 click-throughs to the Stop It Now website, and then approximately 68 calls and chats to the online counselling service. So we know that we've got a disruption from this. So the trend of searching decreased, number of searches decreased for CSAM in the UK during the length of the intervention. And I know that more work is now going to follow on because of this and through this. But the actual help-seeking element, and I'm not in any way suggesting that the fact that people actually stopped, looked at the materials, a smaller number actually went on to actually seek help. 5 minutes, right, this is a quick rattle through. Police to peer, this is so sad. I don't know of any data that relates to this. It was run by the EU, it was run by Europol. And all that it happened was, if you were searching for some content on a peer-to-peer network platform, and as you know, it's a distributed network, there was a honeypot experiment, so there was a file that looked as though it was containing CSAM. If you downloaded that, you'd get a message. It was one of these police, depending on the country, saying, whoa, right, stop. We know that you have tried to access CSAM, but also gave help message as well, that you can contact agencies for help. The brilliant thing about this is that every time somebody else then for example, accessed my library of content, you get that as well. So it's seeded information. Please, if you know of any study that has used that data, I don't. And I don't know how effectively it worked, but I know the people involved in the design of this were very enthusiastic. And we see warning messages from industry. Started to see these in about 2021. You can't really see the content there, but here's another one. Right, sharing images or videos of child sexual abuse is illegal and causes extreme harm. Something you sent contains child nudity or sexual exploitation, no longer viewable. If it happens again, your account may be disabled, right? Some steps you can take. And that included get help. So it's the same sort of model. Accounts that promote this content will be removed. Well, you can create another account. Okay, so nearly done. Post-event, prosecution of offenders, management programs. Okay, what have we got here? Probably the one that has got the most robust evidence is Prevent It. It's an online program. It's therapist-supported, internet-delivered, 8 weeks, CBT, to reduce CSAM viewing amongst users. And it's a randomized control trial, 1 month follow-up, 2019 to 2021 for this particular publication, and people were recruited mainly from the Darknet fora. So they were anonymous, they didn't know who these people were. They examined reports, self-reported change of weekly viewing time from pre to post-treatment. You've only got a month's time frame using the sexual child molestation risk assessment. And there was a larger decrease in viewing time in Prevent It participants than controls. So you've got a fairly rigorous protocol here, but again, you're using self-report data and you've got a short time frame. We've got the Stop It Now programs, and Stop It Now is the one where we are redirecting most people to. They do have face-to-face programs, not just helplines. Psychoeducational programs, and the focus is on emotional support, learning about the offence and practical support. In Scotland, everybody, where there is a seizure of CSAM, will get a Stop It Now brochure, no vouchers, handed over by the police. There is some work that's been done on its effectiveness. It's largely looking at the acceptability and people's perception of whether or not it worked for them. Is there any hard data? No. And then we've got a new one here, the Salus app, which has come out of a collaboration. It's a European group it has come from the Dunkelwald project. Some of you might know that, Klaus Bayer's work. And effectively, it's an app that people voluntarily put on their handheld device. So it's installed on devices, it could be any device, and it monitors internet traffic in real time. So if CSAM or videos are detected, the app blocks content. So it's meant as a way of somebody who feels that they're struggling with their sexual feelings and they're kind of wanting to get content, that it gives opportunity, that they have something that will stop them. I haven't got time to talk about this. This is a child-focused out. This has been my baby for the last 3 years. We have good evaluation data from an efficacy trial. If we don't get more money, no doubt it will sit. If anybody is interested in talking to me about it afterwards, this is iMinds. And it's meant for children who've been sexually abused, not only to help them manage the distress of the abuse, but to offer protection from further abuse, because most of these children are repeat victims. So, lots of challenges here. Most output data self-reported, often relates to intention to commit a crime. Very few longitudinal studies. Data often about usage rather than about offending behavior or re-victimization. Recidivism rates are low in these crimes, although I know people dispute that, and law enforcement particularly does not like, I think, some of the studies that have been produced. But either they're just really good at not getting caught, because they change their pattern of behavior, but the number of people who are reconvicted for these crimes, CSAM crimes, or who go on to commit a more sexually violent crime are relatively low. So, very quick, I'm going to finish. We've talked about this across other papers, other preparations, that crime opportunity theory, we have a likely offender, suitable target, absence of capable guardian. The latter one, I think, is important. So, focus on this kind of suitable target actually draws attention to the context in which the crimes occur. And that seems to me to be absolutely critical. And it moves the focus away from a lot of the research that we have to the context in which these crimes are actually taking place. And very briefly, because I know I'm running over time, right, affordances. So affordances are the possibilities that an object offers for action. And this came from the work of Gibson, where the properties of the object emerge through the interaction between actors, the people involved, and those objects. So what opportunities do I see in different things that I'm using? And in relation to technology, I think this is critical. It's not a property of the object, it's a relationship. It's not a static feature. Opportunities change in terms of how we perceive them. And it doesn't imply that online practices are determined by technology, but rather by how we use it. And you'd see that across all of our behavior. So with CSAM, absence of a capable guardian is really pertinent. Look at this in the context of end-to-end encryption. Who sends the biggest tranche of data to the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children is Meta. Meta is moving to encryption across all of their messaging platforms. Apple sends virtually none, right? So, limited evidence for purposeful use of encryption by offenders. Most people don't bother. They don't need to. Their perception of risk is fairly low in this context. They will only move to using encryption if it's part of their routine practices. So, for example, I think most of us here will use, if you think of WhatsApp, we use WhatsApp. We don't use WhatsApp to commit offenses. But what we see for offenders is where it's part of your existing repertoire, you will use it. If you're trying to contact a child, you will contact them or maybe share images through WhatsApp. Lawless space theory, it's a perception by offenders. The internet is not a lawless space, but there is a perception by offenders that it is. And we know that the more you use it, the more you are likely to believe you're not going to get caught, because the evidence is that you haven't been caught. You've got to have fairly high friction costs before I move to do something else. So very often, the majority of the offenders that we see do not actively use loads of countermeasures. But offenders may use multiple spaces. They move across spaces. They don't stay in a single space, which is increasingly different from what we've seen before, right? And affordances apps, I'm not going to go through this, but they offer opportunities right through anonymity or pseudo-anonymity, encryption and secure communication, decentralization, distributed networks, automation tools, and AI. AI pops up over and over again. 2 days before I came to Australia, the headlines were major case of AI produced, which involved Australia, as part of a network of countries where somebody producing AI content was kind of distributing kind of images to. So, we've got end-to-end encryption, must be our primary one in terms of some of the affordances offered by some of the spaces that are occupied. And end-to-end encryption is problematic on all sorts of levels: detection and monitoring, data access, efficacy of detection tools, privacy and anonymity. I think there are many voices, certainly in the UK, saying, privacy is not a right. We cannot have spaces or tools where we can't access the content because of privacy. So, and AI affordances. So we've got generative AI, tools like ChatGPT and DALL-E, which we all use, but can be used to actually create content which is kind of illegal in itself in most countries, or many countries, or some countries. We've got tools like Undress AI. How anybody thought Undress AI, nudification tools were going to be a good idea and we're not going to cause problems? I have no idea. And we've got content generation and manipulation. And this, again, poses problems for law enforcement in detection and the work that goes along with that. And I promise this is really the end. I know I've run over time, and my apologies. I knew this would happen. And we've got Lantern. I've used this because I think this is the first time we have seen industry coming together. It's a safety cross-platform initiative, and it's a signal sharing program. Lots of platforms have information that is suggestive of illegal activity in terms of either illegal content, but they don't have enough. So what do? If they're a member, is that they will actually share the content. They will upload to Lantern. And what you have is you build then an evidence base, because people are moving across platforms. They do not stay in a single platform. If you look at an interaction with a child, increasingly, different platforms are used to achieve different things. Do they have any? Well, they do have some. This was from their transparency report in 2023. So we've got an increased action by industry on accounts, increased amount of content taken down. It's a small step. I think it's a really positive step. And so the conclusions have got to be lack of clarity about benchmarks for change. Still few studies looking specifically at the context in which these offences take place. Rapid technology change brings more opportunities, and the power to change the online environment still rests largely with the tech companies, and we have to engage with them. Thank you.